Okay, so today I'm speaking with Guy Longworth. Could you introduce yourself for us, Guy?
Hello, I'm Guy. I'm an associate professor at the University of Warwick. I work mainly in issues in epistemology and the philosophy of language. Um, I've written a fair few things in that broad area. Um, I'm currently on the editorial board of the journal Mind and Language, and I'm soon to take over as editor of the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society. So these are the main things I get up to, other than teaching.
Quite big things then. um, well, we're going to be speaking on testimony today. I'm really interested in speaking about this because this is something that I'm not overly familiar with and I find it a really interesting topic. So I was wondering, Guy, if you could run me through some of the basic epistemological problems of testimony.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the biggest problem, the kind of most central problem, I guess, is just how can we ever come to know things by accepting what other people tell us? So it looks like that's something we get up to quite a lot. So, for example, if I'm in an unfamiliar city, I might ask a stranger for directions to the nearest train station. Suppose they tell me some directions, and suppose that they know the directions and what they tell me comes from what they know, then many people think that more or less merely by accepting what I'm told, I can thereby come to know some of what they did. So I can come to know where the train station is, or know that the train station is 200 metres up this road, or what have you. And the most general question in the area is just how that can be possible. I guess one way of thinking about the problems here is by appeal to something like the idea that we ordinarily think that when we know things, we have reasons for the things we come to know, reasons for the beliefs that constitute or underwrite our knowing those things. So I know right now that there's a pen next to me. On what basis? Well, in part because I can see the pen, and my seeing the pen seems to afford me with some kind of reason for believing that the pen's there. And given that that reason's good enough, it looks as though it provides me with a way of knowing that the pen's there. So it's just a very simple case. But now, there's at least initially a puzzle about how someone telling me something can give me reasons to believe what they tell me. In particular, there's a problem in thinking about how those reasons can be good enough to give me a piece of knowledge. So you might think, for example, that where one knows something, the reasons one has need to guarantee for one the truth of what one comes to believe. If one's reasons leave it open, whether or not there's a pen there, for example, it's a glimpse of the top of something black or what have you, then we might think that's not enough to come to know on that basis. And now if we think about bumping into the stranger while searching for the train station, we might think that however good the reasons I get from believing that people are generally trustworthy, this person seems trustworthy, they're not acting in any kind of shifty way, we might think that none of those reasons could be enough to guarantee that the train station's where I'm told that it is. So there's a kind of question at that point, which is that right? And if it is right, what should we do about it? Does it lead to some kind of dramatic skepticism about testimony, about what we think we can come to know from what other people tell us? If it's wrong, we want to know how it's wrong. Are there reasons that aren't straightforwardly, obviously available in that circumstance? Are our reasons derived from some kind of general knowledge about people, or are they special in some other way? Do we get some special kind of reason just through trusting other people, through having some access to their trustworthiness? Or some kind of induction based on past experiences of asking people directions or something of that sort. Philosophers are apt to just be puzzled at that point about how we can have any kinds of reasons in that circumstance, and if we can't, how we can end up acquiring the knowledge we seem to acquire on the basis of other people's testimony. That's the kind of basic problem area.
Which side of the argument do you fall on? Do you think there are sufficient reasons to believe testimony, or do you think that there are not? And if not, what are some of the problems that really stand out to you? What are some of the problems that really stick in your craw, so to speak?
Well, I guess I'm fairly commonsensical about this. I think it's obvious that one can know in these circumstances. So one thing that I think really is non-negotiable is that in lots of cases of that kind, one can acquire knowledge. So that's not to say there are no cases where things go wrong. There are no cases where, for whatever reason, it's not possible for one to acquire knowledge from other people. But I think in vast run of ordinary cases, we do acquire knowledge in those cases. So the question for me is how to account for that. One way of proceeding, I guess, would be to reject one of the driving forces behind the puzzle. So one might reject the idea, for example, that one needs to have reasons in order to know things. Alternatively, and more minimally, one might reject the idea that one needs to have conclusive reasons in order to come to know things. I'm inclined to think that we should resist either of those manoeuvres insofar as it's possible to do so. One worry is that one wants, I think at least initially, one wants to defend the idea not only that one can come to know it from other people's testimony, but more generally that one can come to know with the same kind of standing. One can come to be in the same kind of state of knowing as one might have got into via other means, via seeing, hearing, calculating, or what have you. So I want to resist the idea, for example, that in other cases of knowing, one does require certain sorts of reason or grounds, but in this kind of case, one doesn't. And nonetheless, one has the same kind of outcome state, a state of knowing. So I'd be worried about that, rejecting the demand for reasons in general on those kinds of grounds. And I guess I'd be inclined to reject the weakening of the kinds of reasons that are required for knowing. So one kind of natural manoeuvre at this point would be to say, look, you need reasons to know things, all right. And you might think, if you hadn't reflected on cases of knowledge acquired from testimony, you might think that you need conclusive reasons, conclusive grounds, that it needs to be fixed from your perspective that things are as you take them to be. But now reflecting on testimony, given the fact that we're agreed to that one can acquire knowledge from testimony, and given that we lack conclusive reasons in that case, we have to weaken the reason demand, and we have to weaken it quite generally, given that we want to treat all these cases of knowing in the same way. So from that perspective, someone might think it can be a sort of discovery from reflection on the case of testimony that we don't really need the kinds of conclusive grounds or reasons that we initially took it that we need in order to know. Again, that's something that I'd want to resist, but it's less straightforward to say what the kind of reasons are for wanting to resist that. Really, they come from reflecting on what we take knowledge to be, and how we take it to figure in our lives. And I think answers to questions at that point are non-straightforward. So part of the dispute over testimony then turns on these more general questions about the nature of knowledge and the demands for coming to know. But now that would only arise, those kinds of further complications would only arise if there were no more straightforward way of addressing the initial puzzle. So no more straightforward way of trying to say how it can come to be that one can acquire conclusive reasons simply by being told something by a stranger who speaks from knowledge.
Could you run me through reductionist argument in regards to testimony?
The reductionist or partial reductionist is engaging with the issue at that point. So they're engaging with this puzzle, and they think, look, if you're going to come to know something in any way you need some kinds of reasons or grounds or justification for believing the thing that you take yourself to know. And now they're called reductionists, I guess, because they think that there's a basic range of sources of reason or justification. Let's suppose it's very limited. So suppose it's something like perception, broadly conceived, calculation or deduction or something of that sort, and something like induction. So moving from some array of specific cases to some generalization about a domain or population. So, I've met a bunch of children with blonde hair who are friendly. I've met, say, 100 such children. So I generalize by induction to the claim that all children with blonde hair are friendly. And that might be a bad induction, but there might be good inductions that one can exploit. So suppose you think those are your basic resources for coming to have reasons to believe things. The reductionist thinks something like that, then they're going to think that any account we give of testimony and of the kinds of reasons that are available to us in the case of accepting what people tell us from testimony are going to have to be grounded in one or more of those ways. So they'll think either that one can simply see or otherwise perceive that what one's being told is correct or issued from knowledge, or perhaps they're going to think, or that otherwise that this person's trustworthy or competent in some way, or they're going to think that our grounds or reasons in this case are derived from something like calculation or derived from some kind of a priori reflection, or they're going to think that our reasons are derived from something like induction. And now one strand, one kind of reductionist view is the view that our reasons in this case are derived from some combination of perception and induction. So the idea is that somehow we've had a fair amount of experience of people telling us things that later we discover independently, say by perception, are true. So, I interact with my parents. They tell me there are biscuits in the cupboard every day of the week, and every day I go and check and find some biscuits there. And now, on that basis, but not before having that basis, but on that basis, I come to have some kind of inductive grounds for thinking that when my parents tell me that there are biscuits in the cupboard, there are liable to be biscuits in the cupboard. That provides the basis of my reasons for accepting later on what they tell me. And then somehow experiences of that sort are supposed to figure in helping to underwrite that kind of inductive ground for trusting other people, including strangers in strange cities who offer to tell me where the local train station is. So that's crude, and that's, it's unfair to more sophisticated presentations of the view, but that's the style of view that's presented by a reductionist. They think that there isn't a special range of grounds or reasons that are presented to one just through other people's testimony. So if we're going to reconstruct a story about the kinds of grounds one has in cases of testimony, it's going to be by appeal to resources of those other kinds. So some combination of things like induction and perception, and perhaps a priori reflection, though that typically figures more in so-called anti-reductionist positions in this area, for better or worse. So that's the kind of position, and then the question is whether, or probably more carefully, to what extent we should endorse that kind of position.
And how do the a priori anti-reductionists, how do they push back?
Well, their position is, it'll vary. One form of the position would be to say that at least at a very general level, we have some kind of a priori grounds for a presumption that the things we're told are liable to be correct. and then be a question about, well, what exactly are the grounds for that? What are the a priori reflections that deliver that kind of result? And that can vary. But roughly, you've got a seemingly reasonable individual, or in fact a reasonable individual, a reasonable-minded individual before one, and they're speaking to you. Okay, so you've got two things going on. You've got an individual with reason, and you've got language. So those are going to be your two obvious targets for seeking to reconstruct some kind of a priori ground for some kind of an initial presumption that what they're telling you is true. So one style of view, at some point these views tend to be quite similar, but one style of view will try and argue that it's kind of a priori, that at least in general, or at least by way of some kind of a presumption, what people assert in language is going to correspond with how things are. It's going to be true. Alternatively or connectedly, one might say that, look, there's a kind of a priori presumption that rational individuals will believe things only if they're true, and will say things only if they're true. So one way or another, there's going to be on this style of view, there's going to be a kind of a priori ground for thinking that insofar as the person before you is reasonable or rational, and insofar as they really are making use of language, then what they're doing is presenting you with truths rather than falsehoods. So that's style of position.
This
in part, that view is grounded by perceived weaknesses in more reductionist style positions. So remember, not everyone will endorse all of aspects of these positions, but remember we started from a worry to the effect that insofar as we have any grounds at all in the case of someone offering us some claim via their testimony, via what they tell us, as far as that's going to give us any grounds at all, those grounds aren't going to be conclusive. They're not going to guarantee for us the truth of what we're told. And it's, if you think that's a genuine demand on coming to know things, then you're liable to be worried about the sorts of inductive grounds we could think we had in the case of bumping into a stranger on the way to the train station. What real inductive grounds do we have for thinking that this person isn't going to lead us astray? Do we have reason to think that they're trustworthy? It's not obvious we do. We've never met this person before. People do tell lies. People tell lies capriciously. People tell lies capriciously to strangers. That's something that happens. Moreover, we've got no conclusive grounds for thinking this person's competent. They could be as unfamiliar with the local surroundings as we are, for all we can tell. And if not, they might have a sense of direction as bad as mine. Right? They might just not know. Nonetheless, they might be overconfident about their ability to give instructions. So it's at least natural to think that whatever grounds we can have of a broadly inductive sort, based on our brief interaction with this individual, aren't going to be enough to guarantee for us that what they're telling us is true. So if we think that nonetheless we acquire knowledge from what they tell us, we'll have to think that our grounds are distinct from grounds provided by things like induction. And if we think that, then one natural place to look will be some kind of a priori reflection. And there it'll be at least natural to go for a view that looks for an a priori presumption, something that could be knocked out by empirical, perceptual, inductive grounds, but that in the absence of being knocked out can somehow underwrite conclusive grounds for accepting what we're told. Again, very roughly speaking, people disagree about all aspects of these positions. So in favour of that kind of position is a worry about the capacity of the alternative kind of position to underwrite the kinds of grounds we need to have if we're going to acquire knowledge in this sort of way.
Does that filter into, because one would assume there would have to be some type of trust basis for language itself to develop. you would need to be able to assume, for language to develop as it has, the truth of what people are trying to say, maybe generally. Does that factor into it at all?
That something like that does often factor into the development of positions of these kinds. I think one needs to be a little bit careful about thinking in terms of trust, at least at early developmental stages. It'll depend a bit how exactly one's thinking about trust. More minimally, you'll need it to be the case that kids simply go along with the idea of there being some kind of suitable correspondence between the noises their caregivers are making and how things are in their environments. So there's going to be some analogue of trust involved at various stages. And it's very natural to think that kids are going to be, more trusting in various ways than adults are, and that might well figure essentially in their acquiring language. It's not clear exactly how that kind of consideration can feed into the kinds of reasons one has now. And there are all kinds of things I did as a child that I don't think I'm entitled to do now. So it might be that, generally trusting people is an error. It's something that it's okay when your parents are involved because they're conditioned in various ways to be trustworthy, at least when it comes to caregiving you. But that kind of entitlement simply lapses as one gets older.
What are some of the moral implications for the problems of testimony?
Well, I think there are bound to be indefinitely many moral implications. And really the question is whether there are any that are kind of distinctive. Right, so any case of testimony is going to involve kind of interpersonal interactions of a sort, at least leaving aside special cases like computer testimony, for example, may need different treatment. So you've got people interacting, and typically you've got some combination of a person in some kind of need, so someone who needs some information or at least wants some information. So I need information in order to get from here to the train station. Otherwise, I'm stuffed. And then you've got someone who is willing or unwilling to help with that need, to provide the required information if they can. So already you're in a situation that could easily arise in different forms elsewhere, in ways that one would standardly think have moral implications. Just as in any other case where there are significant wants or needs, and there's the opportunity of someone else to service or fail to service those needs. So from that perspective, there are bound to be, almost indefinitely many kinds of moral issues that arise. Some more specific issues that people have attended to would be, well, one kind of issue that's relatively specific would be, but is also, a very old issue, would be about the probity of lying. So you might think it ought to actually be fairly unusual for someone to lie. So I ask someone for directions. Typically, people might not know the directions to the train station, but if they don't know, then typically they're going to know that they don't know. They're going to realise that they're incompetent in this respect. And in that case, most people, I guess, or people who aren't out to lead people astray, will say, I'm afraid I don't know, I can't help you. So now you're looking for someone who's either both incompetent, they don't know where the train station is, but fails to recognise that that's their position, and so overconfidently offers one directions, or one's looking for a case where someone is incompetent with respect to the directions, recognises they don't know where the train station is, but at the same time decides to offer some kind of arbitrary directions for whatever purpose, for fun. They enjoy leading strangers astray. Perhaps they're some kind of xenophobe. They don't like foreigners in their city, and they like to see them getting lost. The middle case, the case of someone who overconfidently says something, we might think could raise moral issues, depending on the extent to which one can be both culpable for failing to recognise one's incompetence, and also morally culpable for that, at least in circumstances that have further impacts on other people. So a circumstance where someone offers misleading, incompetent directions. But the third case, the case of so to speak, lying or deliberately offering up falsehoods, looks like it's apt to have clear moral reflexes. So it looks like, in general, that person, or at least in this case, that person will have done something wrong. So there's a question there about, whether that's right, whether it's right that lying is in at least some circumstances wrong, and if it is, why is it wrong? What exactly has this person done that's bad, say? And there are also questions about the kind of range of cases. So some people think that Kant, for example, has very strong views in this area and thinks that lying is always wrong. And then there are seeming problem cases for that kind of view. So there are cases where it looks as though, for example, in order to save a life that ought to be saved, one would have to lie. And if Kant thinks, or if anyone thinks, that one should never tell a lie, then it's difficult to see how that can be acceptable, given that it could lead to what seems to be a potentially more significant moral loss. The loss of a human life seems to be more morally significant than simply the telling of a lie. It might be quite a minimal lie. So there are questions there, and there are questions about how to deal with that, about the grounds for thinking that lying is bad. And some of those questions feed into some of the issues about kind of broadly a priori or a non-reductionist basis for accepting what we're told. Because we might think, for example, that we're entitled in general, or there could be arguments to the effect that we're entitled in general to rely upon or trust in the proper functioning, some kind, of people we engage with. We're entitled to rely on the idea that people are, for example, reasonable, that they know a bunch of stuff and so forth. But if that's a general entitlement, we might think that we're also entitled to rely on them not lying to us, because, again, this would take further argument. We'd think that lying, at least in these circumstances, would evince a form of moral badness or wrongness, and we think that that would evince a kind of dysfunction, a kind of failure to properly function as the kind of being a reasonable human is. So we might think we're entitled, in general, to rely on people not lying to us, absent there being reasons in the circumstance for thinking they're liable to lie to us. Pushing that idea from a slightly different perspective, we have the idea that now from the hearer's perspective, the potential recipient of testimony, we have a question from their position, which is whether they should accept what they're being told. And now again, it looks as though taking it that what they're being told is wrong goes along with thinking that there's something like a dysfunction in their interlocutor. Right, so remember that typically, at least, that if there's nothing wrong with you and you're a morally good person and you have reasonably normal levels of self-knowledge, if you don't know where the train station is, you'll know that you don't know where the train station is. And in those circumstances, you won't offer up guidance about where the train station is, at least specific guidance of a sort that goes beyond one's confidence. So in a case where you are offered directions to the train station, very roughly you need to think, and you think, well, perhaps you're being led astray, you need to think either this person doesn't know that they're incompetent, okay, so they're dysfunctional there, or they do know they're incompetent and they're lying, so they're dysfunctional there. So there's a way in which refusal to accept what one's told, modulo there being, specific reasons in the circumstance for doing so, looks like it's a kind of commitment to there being something wrong with the person one's interacting with. And one might think that further moral issues arise there. I think some of those issues connect up with some recent work in what's come to be known as epistemic injustice. I think following work of Miranda Frickers. It's very interesting work, and part of the issue that Miranda wants to discuss, it surrounds the extent to which one can be morally culpable for failing to accept what one's told in certain circumstances, and moreover that there can be structural or other kinds of problems in one's environment and in oneself that lead one to problematically refuse to accept testimony. For example, from individuals in certain putatively recognised groups, right? For example, black people or young people or women. Okay, so that might lead to further moral issues, depending on exactly how those questions are worked out. And dealing with those moral issues might interact with all kinds of social issues about, under what conditions have I been brought up so that I differentially respond to testimony from men and women, for example, and what can we do to try and get past circumstances where a number of people in our society treat people in that way. What kinds of wrongs are involved, for example, over and above mere errors of fact, right? It's clearly going to be an error of fact in lots of cases, because there are going to be plenty of people, both men and women who know, and men and women who don't know. But whether there's also some kind of injustice, some kind of moral injustice involved there, and the extent to which people are culpable there for their differential treatment of people from different groups or different seeming groups.
What sort of solutions have been offered to adjust that differential?
I guess I myself don't think that. Well, it depends what the cases are. So, in general, I don't think it's not really a straightforwardly philosophical matter. Insofar as philosophy is marked off from other disciplines, it's not straightforwardly a philosophical matter to deal with these issues. One can reflect in, for example, political or social philosophy, and one can draw on various relevant bits of empirical work and other people's reflections. But so some solutions are going to involve stuff that philosophers aren't especially competent to deal with. So individual and social psychology. What is it about? What can we do? An education theory. What can we do in bringing children up so that they're properly responsive to how things are? What can we do to help individuals, adult individuals, fix up their, say, biases? And what can we do at more structural levels? What can we do, for example, with respect to institutions, where it might be that tiny bits of bias, for example, with respect to individuals, feed up to much larger disparities at institutional levels that then feed back down into pressures on individuals, and other kinds of ways in which structural features of institutions and groups can feed into having this kind of impact. All those kinds of things that I don't think in general philosophers are especially well placed to deal with. However, one way in which I think philosophers can help, or are distinctively able to help when they're not doing the kind of interdisciplinary work that many people do, that draws on empirical work elsewhere, one kind of thing they can do is respond to bad forms of argument. Okay, so very, very crudely, right, one kind of service that philosophers can do to people in general, the social level, is respond to, for example, bad arguments for moral nihilism or bad arguments for moral relativism. Right, so insofar as adopting forms of moral nihilism or adopting or trying to adopt forms of moral relativism will lead people to do wrong, right, and of course that would take argumentative defence to show, then revealing that those arguments are no good, arguments for those positions are no good, that people have been misled into adopting those positions, can have a kind of defensive role with respect to people doing the right thing. Instead of thinking they can do whatever they want, or that the range of admissible things for them to do is very wide, because they've been misled by bad arguments and seen that the arguments are bad, they might draw in their horns and be less willing to do the kinds of things that some people are willing to do, to be misled by these kinds of positions. And similarly, I guess, in the case of testimony. So, for example, bad arguments for the position that one should always trust people are liable to lead people astray because they give rise to pernicious forms of gullibility. And arguments that one should never trust people are liable to lead one astray in the other direction. And then one can imagine all kinds of intervening positions that mislead people into failing to trust others for bad reasons. Okay, for perhaps overly general reasons or specific reasons that just aren't good. And philosophers might be well placed to uncover those reasons and help undermine them, ultimately.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, I really appreciate the time, Guy.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.